Thanks, Sarah. Difficult to follow such a great technical presentation, particularly with one that's not particularly technical. We have been thinking a lot and working a lot with clients and discussing a lot kind of the shift from, if you like, pre-COVID, but into some systemic change that may drive. And you know, when COVID first started, sorry, give me a second. When COVID first started, there was this joke that went around a lot with who led the digital transformation of your company, and was it the CEO, the CTO, or was it COVID? And I mean, I'm sure many people have seen this, but it's a true thing. You know, this virus achieved in the space of a month and a half what change management hadn't been able to achieve in 10 years, you know, and drove this massive digital transformation. And well, we've been talking about and thinking about, well, who's leading the sustainability transformation and the risk transformation and the strategic transformation in these companies? And of course, these are all interrelated, I mean, all very similar. And a lot of the work that we've been doing over the last 5-10 years is around the change management, around trying to drive some of this change, but conscious that this massive event is taking place and driving a lot of that. I'm going to ask Aiden just to talk a little bit about these risk and societal fault lines, because he's really got a much closer grasp on them. But it's something that you know, exists, and as I say, we've been talking about for a number of years, really trying to see, well, what are the gaps? Let me leave that to Aiden.
Yeah, thanks, Zach. And you know, when we look at the current situation, and if we just use the SDGs as a bit of a lens to kind of diagnose what is happening around us, we've just taken a view of the platinum group metals industry. So countries that are involved in the mining and fabrication of PGMs, Belgium, Germany, Russia, South Africa, and the UK, and using the SDG index as a view of what were the foundations like. So 5 years into the SDG agenda, which is a 15-year agenda, how are countries doing? And you can see from the color coding that there are significant challenges across all countries when it came to looking at SDG performance. So that's some of the bedrock, if you like, of what has been happening and how the fault lines have been emerging in response to COVID. But if we look at South Africa specifically, because this is our country, we know it a little bit more. What it has shown is that certain SDGs are a lot more in focus now than they were previously. And SDG 3 for all countries is obviously the primary concern. That's where the virus and pandemic is really, you know, like putting a big challenge on public health systems and then individual health. But what we're seeing in South Africa is that fault lines on 2 other SDGs are way more prominent than they were before, specifically SDG 2 around hunger and SDG 6 water. And that's because of the poverty levels in our country and the economic impacts of lockdown, people are going hungry. So where we were making good progress on SDG 1 in terms of moving people out of poverty, what we're seeing is that people are now taking a step back. We're having to, organizations in the country are having to focus on food parcel delivery and the provisioning of water and infrastructure required to serve rural communities, and especially communities around mining companies, is a problem. And that's because of the underlying effect, if you like, of SDG 1 poverty and the inequalities in our country, which then just raises the profile of work that should have been done a bit more strategically and with intent around SDG 11, around the sustainability of our communities, and then SDG 8, because a few weeks of lockdown has introduced a set of economic impacts that have put all of those SDGs severely at risk. And we have a view that when you look at what drives performance on those SDGs and whether those SDGs drive performance in other SDGs, we begin to see that we've got to look at those SDGs a little bit differently to be improving performance at them, because the current situation has just raised the profile of those SDGs, and the fault lines are there and are amplifying the challenges that we have to face. Back over to you, Zach.
Thanks. So, I mean, I think one of the key things is that this is a picture right now, but the truth is that these fault lines have been around for a long time, and I think there's been some great work in trying to understand how we can start to address them. You know, everybody's talking about these new economies, and if you haven't read the donut economy, this top left, it's one of the most fantastic models that's come out in the last number of years. A woman called Kate Raworth, I may be mispronouncing that, but the donut economy really says, look, for society to continue, we have to live within these bands. You know, there's a social foundation minimum that we need to be producing to keep everybody alive and healthy, and then there's an ecological ceiling in terms of how do we not be greedy and not create this incredible economic, environmental and socioeconomic destruction that we've been creating. The point is, there's the circular economy. You know, we talk about innovation, we talk about the sharing economy, the experience. The point is that there are a number of models that have been coming out over the last 15, 20, 30 years, talking about how do we shift into a space that is less kind of our standard economic model of supply and demand, and just create. Okay, create, throw away, create, throw away, create, throw away. And so at a very high level, this has existed, and I think that this moment in time is likely to move us more strongly towards some of those. The challenge from our perspective, and certainly this has been the case with clients, is how do you now translate that to a corporate level? And one of the things that we've been asking is, what if when we report, what if when we do our strategy, what if in everything that we do at a corporate level, we answer these three questions? We talk from an economic perspective, how are we contributing to the fiscus? And there I'm talking broadly. So I'm including in that your your shareholder returns. I'm including in that things like your tax. I'm including in that your money that's going into savings. But how do you generate an economically strong company? What are we doing to this generation? So from a societal perspective, what is your business doing that is impacting the current society? And there's a lot of work there. And I know in South Africa, again, you know, there's this group, Business for South Africa, that has grown out of nothing at the start of this crisis and has the most incredible approach on saying, we are not, nobody in it is trying to make money. It's about 300 to 400 very, very senior business people from around South Africa, all volunteering time to try and address the health, but also the economic crisis that's occurring. And then finally, the last question around the environment is, what are we leaving for future generations? And I think if we start to try and answer those three questions in all of our reporting and all of our approach, our strategizing, etc., we begin to think about things very differently, and we begin to think about the whole value, the complete value. Now, this isn't our model. This is actually based, the questions asked, but this is based on the Stockholm Institute model, which they've developed off the SDGs, talking about three layers: biosphere, society, economy, and they tag all of that together with partnership, and really about how the SDGs fit into these. So from our perspective, and we've been talking about this for a long time, this concept of whole value, of a company presenting their entire value set, value proposition, and when we talk about value, we're saying, well, what value do you add to the world, not what earnings do you achieve every quarter. You know, now if you're a chief exec in the last number of years, you've had this massive challenge because you've got this liquid capital challenge in that capital is shifting very quickly, trying to find the short-term highest returns. There's this fear of failure. There's a real herd mentality around how that capital moves around. There's less and less investment for long-term, investment for stability. But at the same time, you've got society with these kind of louder voices, challenging you to be good. And these are, these often raise what we call charismatic issues, So you might be a company that's doing a lot of real good in the world, and you might be adding value and you're employing a number of people, but you produce a lot of CO2, for example. Now, we can argue as much as we like about whether that supersedes everything else. The fact of the matter is it's only part of the picture. And so unless you can show that whole picture, you will continue to just be caned about the CO2 emissions. So we really try to migrate to this picture of looking at it at whole value. And what we've seen more and more as we've worked with our clients is this begins to de-risk the company. And I think we're seeing, and we're doing a little bit of research on this, so I don't want to guess what the answer is going to be until we've seen it come out. But I think we're going to see that companies that have a better picture of their total value to society have survived or have worked their way through this COVID crisis much better because they are more stable. So there's a de-risking. There's an intent and accountability to society, and this creates this two-way accountability that civil society can turn around and ask the big questions, ask the difficult questions. But equally, an organization can turn around and say, well, guys, have you considered the full picture? And this is a space where the SDGs remain very relevant. I think there's been quite a lot of chat of, look, COVID set us back 3, 5, 10, 15, 20, who knows, but a number of years. And does this mean that we're not going to hit the goals? Very possibly we're not going to. But the framework remains so relevant as a basis, as a mediating framework for this whole narrative about our intent and about our complete performance. So when you start to take the SDGs and you weave them in, you look at your organizational risk, you look at your strategic focus areas, and you look at your SDGs, and you start to get a woven picture of how all of these interact, you begin to understand that this is a much more, that having visibility across this very complex environment becomes so much more important. And by doing this, we can start to identify, well, what are the key things that we're really trying to monitor and trying to stretch ourselves in order to ensure that we're not just targeting earnings or just targeting short-term thinking and charismatic issues. And so coming out of this, what we've seen with some clients that are starting to use this is, when you start to increase this visibility, we have our strategic flow, our strategic planning, but then start to turn this into specific tactical visibility approaches. And you begin to create a much more stable system. You begin to create a system where you can build strategic resilience through having more intentional approaches to your interactions and your ripples of impact. You can understand, Aiden spoke very briefly, but this image on the right here is this mapping of which SDGs drive which other SDGs. So all of them are very, very interrelated. And when we start to understand that interaction and that interrelation of these, we see, well, if we do X, Y, Z, A, B, C are going to happen. And what does that look like? Then we can also start to identify these fault lines and where they expose us and our organization to additional risk, and we can start to manage that proactively. And finally, we get an opportunity, and this is, I think as South Africans, we often feel like we're the only ones who really need to push our governments hard to do better, but we're clearly not. I think that's come out very clearly during this crisis, is that actually governments all over the world are just a little, finding it a bit tough. And so there's definitely an opportunity here to engage and support public institutions to reimagine and start to repair some of those societal fault lines a bit more proactively. And that's where we see this taking a complete view, taking a full framed picture, understanding where all the interrelationships are, begins to create a de-risked environment. Because although COVID is a once-in-a-generation situation, it's going to start happening more and more often. It may not be COVID next time, but there will be more and more huge world-defining events that happen. And I did see a little while ago, it was a comedic thing, but it was really funny, where this woman starts off and she's talking to herself from a little bit in the future. And she says, yeah, the Australian wildfires, those are going to be the defining event of the year. And when you think about it, they were only 4 months ago, and yet just seem like nothing now. So these kinds of defining events, these enormous world-changing events are happening more and more often. They're going to continue to happen more and more often. And it's, I think, our job and our responsibility to begin to have a better picture from a corporate company perspective of what that whole mesh is and where we sit within it. Okay. Any questions?
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Zak and Aiden. That was absolutely brilliant. And a round of applause coming at you from around the world behind all of those muted microphones. Just as we let those questions filter in, so we've obviously got a number of different channels where the chat is going on, which is great. I think with regards to this, guys, I mean, it's fantastic to see the evolution of what you're doing. It's really exciting. You've obviously got that business case in terms of how a company can be more resilient with regards to a crisis such as COVID-19 if they're looking at the whole value with regards to what they're doing. Have you seen any examples of where say, investors or customers or communities, for example, are using this approach or making use of it to try and rank or benchmark companies against one another?
Yeah, a bit more of a difficult question. I think, some of the investors that we've been speaking to have been saying, look, they are still battling to interpret, they conceptually approve of it, but they're battling to interpret how that translates into actual share price. I think one of the things that we're seeing here is that by companies that are taking these sort of proactive approaches and being able to de-risk, if we have a look at, I mean, I'm reticent to mention the specific mining company, but one of the leaders in the space has been Anglo American, and they have gone through this crisis in the same way everybody else has, with their hair on fire, but they've been able to shift and move around and respond much more quickly and much more fully than many others. Some of the other mining companies that we've been working with in South Africa have had a similar approach. One of the big chemical companies that we've been working with. So I think, from an investment perspective, I think it's more that there may be a slightly lagging indicator there of investors beginning to see that these organizations that are behaving in this full way are less risky and are more stable through that process. And so I think that we may see a slight lagging indicator on that. I mean, Sarah, that some of the work that we've done with, for example, the Church Commissioners and the Transition Pathway Initiative, there are investors that are driving very strongly and very actively this kind of next step in responsibility. But for the broader investment market, I think that there will be a shift towards better understanding of the risk that they're exposed to. And when they can present this as a full picture, when companies present this as a full picture, investors will start to say, okay, well, those are less risky companies. I'm going to invest more. And there I'm talking the big investors. I mean, I'm talking the pension funds and the guys for who risk is a real big, threats are a bigger challenge than the opportunity of the uncertainty.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Zak. And I think what you're describing there is, of course, not necessarily the holy grail, but it's what all of those investors are after at the moment. How do they get that true risk profile rather than just the financial, for example, risk profile or technical risk profile of a company? Brilliant. One very, very quick final question for you, Zak and Aiden, if I may. This comes from Christopher Reeves. He says, always good to hear, Zak and Aiden, given the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals were written for governments to achieve, how have you looked at the weighting of the SDGs for business so that they show how they are enabling / contributing rather than being responsible for, and therefore becoming surrogate development agencies? So that's the business versus government question.
It's such a great question, and it's what our whole business was born out of, was, we began with developing a translation layer, effectively, if you like, from that government level down to a company level. And I think to answer that question very specifically, I don't think that it's the responsibility of companies to achieve the SDGs. And I don't think that's what we're trying to say. I think what we're saying is that using the SDGs as a framework, because they are such a good framework, and it could be another one, you know, we could replace it with something else, but the concept of using them as a framework to show the whole value and the interrelatedness of all of our activities is where the real value is for companies. So the intention here is not to say each company must hit those goals. The intention is to say, if a company is spending and working in this area and this space, what are their progressions and how are they doing? And that's really where this kind of tactical visibility that we've spoken about, you know, starts to come in, is being able to say, okay, well, within your own space, within your own key headline metrics, what are you achieving and how are you progressing?
And Zach, if I could add to that, you know, practically, I think what this means for companies is that the best practice that has emerged over the last 5 years is for companies to choose kind of 4 prioritized SDGs to focus on. And they've done that through a range of methodologies, but fundamentally it's been about, you know, what does that look like as a prioritization to certain stakeholder groups? And I think now, looking at how these fault lines have emerged and how brittle and fragile our efforts have been in relation to some of these SDGs, we're going to be able to see how a prioritization of SDGs, not trying to achieve all 17 of them, but as a business, focusing on a distinct set, is going to have ripple effects and knock-ons that we would like to see that kind of seam over these fault lines a little bit more. And I think along with the revision of targets of SDGs, I think we're going to have companies looking at their prioritization a little bit differently, and not necessarily pandering that prioritization to stakeholders who are shouting the loudest. And I think, you know, Sarah, back to your question earlier as well, I think communities are going to be looking at their needs a little bit differently as well, because where they thought they were okay in relation to some of the SDGs, they've now realized that, you know, no economic activity for a few weeks raises other blips on the radar, and they're going to be looking at their own needs and how that partnership between private and public institutions moves society forward.
Brilliant. Thank you very, very much. Aiden, Zach, another round of virtual applause. Absolutely brilliant. Thank you, guys.